Welcome back. Get comfortable. This one asks something of you. Not much, just a willingness to sit with a creature that doesn't quite make sense. And to find, in that strangeness, something quietly wonderful. A claw almost 1 meter long. Not a whole animal, just the claw itself, curved like a scythe, longer than your arm from shoulder to fingertip. When the first bones of this animal were pulled from the rock of the Gobi Desert in 1954, the scientists who found them thought they were looking at a giant turtle. Not a dinosaur. A turtle. That tells you something right away. Not just about the animal, but about how completely it defies expectation. The Rhizinosaurus cheloniformis. The name means, roughly, the scythe lizard that resembles a turtle. And for decades, it was barely more than a mystery written in bone. A few fragments from a remote desert, enormous in scale, impossible to categorize. Even today, after 70 years of discovery and debate, there are things about this animal that science cannot tell you. Things the fossils themselves simply don't contain. But what they do contain is extraordinary. So let's start where the evidence starts. Not with theories, not with reconstructions, but with the bones themselves. What was actually found, what it actually tells us, and what it doesn't. The year was 1948. A joint Soviet-Mongolian expedition was moving through the Nemegt Formation, a vast stretch of late Cretaceous rock in the southern Gobi, in what is now southern Mongolia. The Nemegt is remarkable even by fossil standards. It preserves a world that existed roughly 70 to 75 million years ago. A floodplain ecosystem dense with life. Titanosaur sauropods, ankylosaurs, early mammals, and predators like Tarbosaurus, the Asian relative of Tyrannosaurus rex. It was in this formation that the expedition first encountered the bones that would become Therizinosaurus. Not in 1948, as it turned out. The formal recovery and description came later, in 1954, when the Russian paleontologist Evgeny Maleev examined the material and gave it a name. What he had in front of him were forelimb bones, massive, elongated, unlike anything previously catalogued from the Mesozoic. And those claws. Maleev was a careful scientist. He did not rush to conclusions. But the bones were so unlike any theropod dinosaur then known that his initial interpretation placed the animal in an entirely different group, a large, specialized reptile of uncertain affinity. The turtle hypothesis held for years. It would take several more decades and discoveries from places far outside Mongolia to understand what Therizinosaurus actually was. Here is what Maleev actually had. Forelimb bones. Specifically, 3 partial forelimbs, including the bones of the hand and the extraordinary manual unguals, the technical term for the claw bones themselves. These claws were not simply large. They were proportionally unlike anything else known from a bipedal dinosaur. The longest preserved ungual measures approximately 94 centimeters. That is just under 1 meter. Add the keratin sheath, the actual claw material, which is almost never preserved, and the living claw in the animal would have been longer still. Think for a moment about what a meter-long claw actually means. Hold your arm straight out in front of you, the distance from your shoulder to the tips of your fingers. For most adults, that is somewhere between 60 and 70 centimeters. The claw of Therizinosaurus was longer than that. Not the whole arm, the claw. These claws curved gently, not sharply. This matters. A tightly curved, laterally compressed claw, like the killing claw of Velociraptor, is shaped for puncturing and gripping. The claws of Therizinosaurus were more gently bowed, laterally broad and blunted at the tip. They were not designed for stabbing. Whatever they were for, it was something else entirely. But for many years, without a clearer picture of the whole animal, interpretation was difficult. The forelimbs alone couldn't settle the question, and the skull, the single most informative part of any dinosaur skeleton for understanding diet and behavior, has never been found. Not a fragment, not a tooth, nothing. That absence is not a footnote. It sits at the center of everything we think we know about how Therizinosaurus lived. What changed the picture came not from Mongolia, but from other animals, relatives discovered over decades across Asia and eventually North America, that slowly filled in the evolutionary context around Therizinosaurus. These relatives belong to a group called the Therizinosaurs, or in older literature, the Segnosaurs. And the story of how scientists came to understand this group is itself a lesson in how science actually works. Slowly, through the accumulation of evidence, with wrong turns along the way. The first Therizinosaur that anyone understood as a Therizinosaur was not Therizinosaurus itself. It was a much smaller, more completely preserved animal called Segnosaurus, described in 1979 from Mongolia, also from the Cretaceous. Segnosaurus preserved parts of the skeleton that Therizinosaurus lacked: the pelvis, the hind limbs, some vertebrae. And these bones revealed something unexpected. The pelvis of Segnosaurus was opisthopubic, meaning the pubic bone pointed backward rather than forward. This is the same pelvic orientation found in birds. In most other theropod dinosaurs, the group that includes Tyrannosaurus, Velociraptor, and Spinosaurus, the pubis points forward. This single anatomical detail caused enormous confusion. For years, scientists debated whether these animals even belonged among theropods at all. Some argued they were more closely related to the long-necked sauropods. Others placed them in entirely separate lineages. The argument ran through the 1980s with no clear resolution. What finally settled it was a combination of detailed anatomical analysis and, critically, the discovery of smaller, more primitive members of the group, animals that preserved the full range of the Therizinosaur features in early, clearly theropod form. One of the most important of these was Falcarius utahensis, described in 2005 from the Cedar Mountain Formation of Utah in the western United States. Falcarius was a relatively early therizinosaur, dating to roughly 125 million years ago, significantly older than Therizinosaurus, and it was recovered in extraordinary numbers. Thousands of bones from a single site, representing dozens of individuals. This is direct evidence stated plainly. The bones of Falcarius exist in abundance, and their anatomy firmly places the entire group within theropod dinosaurs. The broader implication of Falcarius was significant. It confirmed that therizinosaurs evolved from carnivorous ancestors, animals whose relatives were meat-eaters, and had, over millions of years, shifted toward a radically different way of feeding. The claws were not an escalation of predatory equipment. They were the remnant and the repurposing of a predatory body plan turned towards something entirely different. This is where the diet question becomes both clearest and most complicated, and it requires being precise about what we know and what we are inferring. The skull of Therizinosaurus has never been found. That is direct evidence of an absence, the most honest thing that can be said. What we know about the likely diet of Therizinosaurus comes entirely from its relatives, whose skulls have been preserved and studied in detail. The most informative of these is Erlikosaurus andrewsi, described in 1980 from the same Nemegt formation as Therizinosaurus. Erlikosaurus preserved a nearly complete skull, and that skull tells a clear story. The teeth are small, leaf-shaped, and serrated, consistent with processing plant material rather than flesh. The jaw articulation suggests a relatively weak bite compared to carnivorous theropods. The nasal and palatal structures resemble those of other herbivorous dinosaurs. This is reasoned inference, stated as such. The skull of Erlikosaurus, combined with the skull anatomy of other therizinosaurs like Bapiosaurus and Nothronicus, makes a strong cumulative case that the group as a whole was herbivorous or at minimum omnivorous, with plant material forming the dominant part of the diet. The inference for Therizinosaurus specifically is strong, but it is still an inference. A careful scientist would not state it as certainty. So, giant claws, herbivore, a meat-eater's body plan, redirected toward plants. How do we make sense of this? Think about the last time you tried to reach something just slightly too high, on a shelf or in a tree or hanging above you, and you had to stretch, extend your arm to its full length, the effort in your shoulder and your upper back. Now imagine doing that all day, every day as your primary means of feeding. The reach is the tool. This is the leading interpretation for those extraordinary forelimbs. The Therizinosaurus, based on what we can reconstruct from its arm bones and compare to its relatives, had forelimbs of remarkable length relative to its body. The arms could extend outward and downward, and the claws, those impractical, enormous, gently curved claws, could hook branches, pull them down, hold them in place, not grip them with precision but anchor them, bend the branch toward the mouth, access food that other animals, without those arms, couldn't reach. This is reasoned inference. The mechanical logic is sound. The claw's shape is consistent with this function. But no one has found a Therizinosaurus with stomach contents. No one has found preserved plant material associated with these animals. The feeding hypothesis is built from comparative anatomy and biomechanical reasoning, not from direct observation of what the animal ate. What we can speak about with more confidence is scale. The Rhizinosaurus was enormous. Based on the limb bones that have been recovered, forelimbs, and some associated material, estimates place it among the largest therizinosaurs and among the largest theropod dinosaurs overall. Size estimates in paleontology always carry uncertainty, particularly when the skeleton is incomplete. For Therizinosaurus, the skeleton is very incomplete. The figures most commonly cited place the animal at roughly 9 to 12 meters in length and potentially 5 to 6 metric tons in mass. These numbers are extrapolated from the limb proportions of better-known relatives, scaled up to fit the recovered material. They are informed estimates, not measurements. What the bones do show directly is that the arms were built for power as well as reach. The humerus, the upper arm bone, is robust. The overall limb architecture suggests significant muscular attachment. Whatever those claws were doing, the animal had the strength to do it forcefully. Now imagine that animal. The light is flat and pale, the way it gets in the late afternoon over a floodplain when the haze comes in low from the south. The vegetation along the Nemegt waterways is dense here, not the sparse scrub of the open basin, but thicker growth. Cycads, ferns, early flowering plants, conifers with their heavy boughs. The air smells of water and wet sediment. And then, at the edge of the tree line, something moves. It is slow at first, barely perceptible, a shifting of shadow between the tall cycads. Then the scale becomes clear. What you took for the edge of a fallen trunk is a leg. What you mistook for a low branch is an arm. The animal is standing still, its weight balanced on its hind legs, its small head, relative to its body, tilted upward. One forearm extends. The claw, that absurd, impossible claw, curves around the lower branch of a conifer and pulls. The branch bends slowly, reluctantly, then yields. The animal doesn't rush. It doesn't need to. Nothing here would challenge it. It is simply the largest thing in this part of the floodplain, and it knows that the way very large things know things, not as a thought, but as a fact that has never needed to be tested. Here is where the fossil record opens up in a direction that changes the picture entirely, and where a discovery made far from Mongolia, in a different country and a different decade, becomes essential to understanding Therizinosaurus. In 1996, researchers working with material from the Yixian Formation of Liaoning Province in northeastern China described a new Therizinosaur, Beipiaosaurus inexpectus. The name means, roughly, the unexpected one from Beipiao. It earned that name. Beipiaosaurus was small, roughly 2.5 meters long, a fraction of the size of Therizinosaurus. But preserved in the fine-grained rock of the Yixian in extraordinary detail were structures surrounding the arms and portions of the body that were unmistakably filamentous. These were not the fully developed flight feathers of a bird. nor the contour feathers of a modern wing. They were long, simple, unbranched filaments, structures researchers now classify as a primitive form of feather insulation. Later study of additional Bapiosaurus specimens identified a second type of structure: longer, stiffer, ribbon-like feathers, believed to have been display features rather than insulation. This is direct evidence. The structures are preserved in rock. They are there. What they tell us about Therizinosaurus is inference, but it is inference of a strong and commonly accepted kind. Bapiosaurus is a therizinosaur. It had feathers. The broader evolutionary context of theropod dinosaurs strongly supports the idea that feathering was widespread across the group. The inference that Therizinosaurus, as a large therizinosaur, bore at least some form of feather-like integument is reasonable and broadly accepted among specialists. Whether those structures covered the whole body, only portions of it, or were reduced due to the animal's size, as sometimes happens in very large animals where insulation becomes less critical, is not known. Size matters here. Large-bodied animals generate more internal heat relative to their surface area. Some researchers have suggested that at the scale of Therizinosaurus, extensive feather coverage might have posed a problem of overheating rather than cold. This is speculation, noted briefly as such. The evidence does not resolve it. What the Bapiosaurus discovery does, unambiguously, is this. It makes Therizinosaurus something other than a bare-skinned reptile in the popular imagination. It places this animal in the same continuum of feathered theropods that eventually produced birds. The scythe lizard and the sparrow on your windowsill share more than anyone would have predicted when Maliv first described those claws in 1954. There is something worth sitting with in that connection. Evolution doesn't move toward a goal. It doesn't have a destination. It simply moves, one generation at a time, through the filter of what works well enough to survive. The Therizinosaurs began, as far as the evidence currently shows, in a lineage of small, probably carnivorous theropods. Over tens of millions of years, across dozens of species, that lineage shifted. The teeth changed. The gut expanded. The arms grew longer. The claws became something a meat-eater would have no use for. And at the end of that line, at least in terms of sheer size, stood Therizinosaurus, a creature so far from its origins that the scientists who found it couldn't recognize what it was. This transformation didn't happen in any individual animal's lifetime. It happened across geological time, generation by generation, each small shift selected for by an environment that rewarded it. The large fermenting gut that could process tough plant material. The long arms that could access food no competitor could reach. The claws that could apply enough force to bend a conifer branch. Each of those things was once new. Each of them, at some point, existed in only a handful of animals, and each of them, gradually, became the defining features of an entire lineage. There's a particular kind of patience embedded in that process. Not the patience of a creature making a choice, Animals don't choose their evolution, but something that looks, from the outside, like patience. Like an argument being made very, very slowly, with each generation adding one more sentence until the case is complete. And then, 71 million years ago or thereabouts, it ended. Not because the argument failed, not because the animal was poorly designed, because the world changed, suddenly and catastrophically, in a way that no terrestrial megafauna survived. What we do not know about Therizinosaurus is, in some ways, more interesting than what we do. No skull has ever been found. This means the exact shape of the head, the arrangement of the teeth, the structure of the nasal passages, the size and orientation of the eyes, all of it remains unknown. Every reconstruction of Therizinosaurus that shows a face is extrapolated from relatives. Some of those relatives are reasonably close. None of them are Therizinosaurus. No skin impressions have been found associated with this animal. The feather inference from Bapiosaurus is well supported, but remains an inference. We do not know what the surface of Therizinosaurus looked like. No eggs or nesting material have been attributed to this animal with confidence. Some Therizinosaur eggs have been identified from Mongolia and China, flattened, elongated forms with distinctive eggshell microstructure. But associating eggs with adults is notoriously difficult in the fossil record, and no eggs have been conclusively linked to Therizinosaurus specifically. We do not know if Therizinosaurus was solitary or social. Some researchers have noted that Therizinosaur remains occasionally occur in groups, which could suggest gregarious behavior. The evidence is thin. What the bones tell us directly is only that multiple individuals sometimes ended up in the same depositional environment. That could mean they lived together. It could mean they died near the same water source. We do not know how the animal held itself while feeding, whether it reared up on its hind legs, whether it crouched, whether it used its tail as a counterbalance in the way a kangaroo does. All of these are plausible inferences from the skeletal architecture. None of them are confirmed. And we do not know the full extent of its range. The Nemegt Formation has produced the only confirmed Therizinosaurus material. Related animals are known from China, from Central Asia, from North America. Whether Therizinosaurus itself ranged beyond Mongolia, whether it was widespread or locally restricted, the fossils haven't answered this yet. Each of these gaps is a real gap, not a gap in our imagination of the animal, but a gap in the rock record itself. In paleontology, absence of evidence is genuinely complicated. The fossil record is never complete, and the absence of a skull doesn't mean the animal lacked a skull. It means the skull, if it exists, hasn't been found yet, or hasn't been preserved, or is sitting unidentified in a museum drawer somewhere. Each of these is possible. None of them is the same as the other. What we do not know about Therizinosaurus is, in some ways, more interesting than what we do. No skull has ever been found. This means the exact shape of the head, the arrangement of the teeth, the structure of the nasal passages, the size and orientation of the eyes. all of it remains unknown. Every reconstruction of Therizinosaurus that shows a face is extrapolated from relatives. Some of those relatives are reasonably close. None of them are Therizinosaurus. No skin impressions have been found associated with this animal. The feather inference from Bapiosaurus is well supported, but remains an inference. We do not know what the surface of Therizinosaurus looked like. No eggs or nesting material have been attributed to this animal with confidence. Some Therizinosaur eggs have been identified from Mongolia and China, flattened, elongated forms with distinctive eggshell microstructure. But associating eggs with adults is notoriously difficult in the fossil record, and no eggs have been conclusively linked to Therizinosaurus specifically. We do not know if Therizinosaurus was solitary or social. Some researchers have noted that Therizinosaur remains occasionally occur in groups, which could suggest gregarious behavior. The evidence is thin. What the bones tell us directly is only that multiple individuals sometimes ended up in the same depositional environment. That could mean they lived together. It could mean they died near the same water source. We do not know how the animal held itself while feeding, whether it reared up on its hind legs, whether it crouched, whether it used its tail as a counterbalance in the way a kangaroo does. All of these are plausible inferences from the skeletal architecture. None of them are confirmed. And we do not know the full extent of its range. The Nemegt Formation has produced the only confirmed Therizinosaurus material. Related animals are known from China, from Central Asia, from North America. Whether Therizinosaurus itself ranged beyond Mongolia, whether it was widespread or locally restricted, the fossils haven't answered this yet. Each of these gaps is a real gap, not a gap in our imagination of the animal, but a gap in the rock record itself. In paleontology, absence of evidence is genuinely complicated. The fossil record is never complete, and the absence of a skull doesn't mean the animal lacked a skull. It means the skull, if it exists, hasn't been found yet, or hasn't been preserved, or is sitting unidentified in a museum drawer somewhere. Each of these is possible. None of them is the same as the other. There's a question worth drifting toward tonight, as you settle into sleep. We spend a great deal of time trying to understand things by sorting them into categories. What something is, what group it belongs to, how it fits the pattern we already recognize. And then something like Therizinosaurus appears, and none of the categories quite hold. It is a predator that became a herbivore. It is a dinosaur that looks, at first, like a turtle. It is a theropod that built something birds would eventually inherit, without knowing it, without intending it. It defies the boxes, not through any effort of its own, but simply by being what it was, fully and without compromise. There is something worth admiring in that. The Gobi Desert is quiet tonight. It has been quiet for a very long time. Somewhere beneath that sand, there may be more. More bones, more clues, more of the picture we haven't yet recovered. A skull, perhaps, someday. The rock holds its secrets carefully, and it releases them on its own terms, not ours. But when it does release them, there are people ready to receive them, people who have devoted years to understanding what the stones are trying to say. That work goes on, slowly, carefully, honestly. And that, I think, is worth knowing. If the Rhizinosaurus stayed with you tonight, those improbable claws, that vast, unhurried body moving through the late Cretaceous afternoon, then I'm glad we spent this time here together. The fossil record is full of stories still half told, and I'd love to keep exploring them with you. If you'd like to return, subscribing means you won't miss what comes next. Sleep well.